The afternoon sun was streaming through the windows of Willowbrook Nursing Home when my daughter Linda leaned forward in her chair with the kind of smug satisfaction that meant she was about to deliver what she thought was a crushing blow. "You might as well accept reality, Mom," she said, her voice carrying the patronizing tone she'd perfected over the past 6 months since my stroke. "You're never going back to that house. This is your home now." The cruelty in her words was matched only by the calculating gleam in her eyes as she waited for my reaction. What Linda didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that I'd been carrying my own secret for weeks, waiting for exactly this moment to reveal that the foundation of all her scheming had already crumbled beneath her feet. "Actually, Linda," I said, watching her confident expression begin to falter, "strangers are living in that house now. I sold it 3 weeks ago. But let me start from the beginning, because this story isn't just about real estate or family manipulation. It's about what happens when the people you trust most see your vulnerability as their opportunity, and how sometimes the best way to protect yourself is to make sure there's nothing left for them to steal. My name is Margaret Chen, and 6 months ago, at the age of 74, I suffered a stroke that changed everything about my life in ways both visible and invisible. The stroke itself had been relatively mild. I'd regained most of my speech and mobility within a few weeks, but the recovery process had revealed truths about my family that were far more devastating than any physical disability. I'd lived in the same house in suburban Portland for 43 years, ever since my late husband Robert and I had purchased the modest ranch-style home when we were young parents, planning to raise our 3 children in a neighborhood with good schools and safe streets. The house on Maple Avenue had been the center of our family's life for decades, hosting birthday parties and holiday celebrations, providing a home base for children who grew up and moved away, and serving as the gathering place where 4 grandchildren had learned to associate my address with warmth, stability, and unconditional love. The house was also my largest asset, worth approximately $450,000 after decades of appreciation in Portland's competitive real estate market. More importantly, it represented my independence and my connection to a lifetime of memories that I'd shared with Robert before his death 8 years earlier. My 3 children, Linda, 52 and working as a real estate agent, Michael, 49 and employed as an accountant, and Susan, 45 and teaching high school English, had grown up in that house and maintained different levels of connection to both the property and to me as their aging mother. Linda had always been the most financially motivated of my children, with a tendency to view family relationships through the lens of potential profit and personal advantage. Her work in real estate had given her extensive knowledge about property values and inheritance planning, and she'd been making increasingly pointed comments about my house's value and my ability to maintain such a large property as I aged. Michael was quieter and more cautious, approaching family finances with the methodical thinking that served him well in his accounting career. He'd expressed general concerns about my ability to manage household maintenance and property taxes on a fixed income, but he'd never pressured me to make changes to my living arrangements. Susan was the most emotionally connected to the house itself, often reminiscing about childhood memories and expressing hope that the property would remain in our family for future generations. She talked about potentially buying the house from me someday if I ever decided to downsize, though her teacher's salary made such a purchase financially challenging. When I'd suffered my stroke in early March while working in my garden, Linda had been the first family member to arrive at the hospital and had immediately positioned herself as my primary advocate and decision-maker during the medical crisis. "Don't worry about anything, Mum," Linda had said during those first frightening days when I wasn't sure whether I'd regain my ability to speak clearly or walk independently. "I'll handle all the practical details so you can focus on getting better." Linda's assistance during my hospitalization had been genuinely helpful and apparently motivated by love and concern for my well-being. She'd coordinated with my doctors, managed communications with extended family and friends, and handled the dozens of practical arrangements that serious illness requires. But as my recovery progressed, and I'd been transferred to Willowbrook Nursing Home for rehabilitation and physical therapy, Linda's helpful assistance had gradually evolved into something that felt more controlling and self-serving. "The doctors think you should plan on staying here for several months," Linda had told me during one of my early weeks at Willowbrook. "Your house is going to be sitting empty all that time, and empty houses are targets for break-ins and vandalism." Linda had convinced me to give her temporary access to my house so she could check on the property, collect mail, and handle any maintenance issues that might arise during my extended absence. I'd signed a limited power of attorney that allowed her to manage my household affairs while I was unable to do so myself. But Linda's management of my household affairs had quickly expanded beyond what I'd intended or authorized. She'd been going through my personal papers, reviewing my financial accounts and making decisions about my property that she'd presented as necessary for my protection, but that actually served her own interests. I've been researching assisted living facilities that might be more appropriate for your long-term needs, Linda had told me during one of her visits. This nursing home is fine for rehabilitation, but you're going to need somewhere more permanent when you're ready to be discharged. The assumption that I wouldn't be returning to my own home had been presented as medical necessity, but I'd begun to suspect that Linda's eagerness to find me alternative housing was motivated by her desire to gain control of my property rather than by genuine concern for my welfare. My suspicions had been confirmed when I'd overheard Linda talking to someone on her phone outside my room at Willowbrook, discussing my house as if it were already hers to manage. The property is worth at least $450,000, maybe more in this market, Linda had been saying. Once we get Mom settled in assisted living, we can start thinking about the best way to handle the sale. The casual way Linda had referred to we and the sale had made it clear that she was already making plans for my house without any input from me or from her siblings. But the most disturbing conversation I'd overheard had taken place the previous week, when Linda had been talking to someone who was apparently a real estate contact about strategies for selling property belonging to elderly family members. The key is to get them settled somewhere they're comfortable and then present the house sale as a practical necessity, Linda had explained to her contact. Once they're out of the house for a few months, it becomes easier to argue that they can't manage independent living anymore. The conversation had revealed that Linda's assistance with my care had been part of a calculated strategy to separate me from my property and position herself to control the sale of my house. That night, I'd called my attorney from the phone in my room at Willowbrook and explained my concerns about Linda's behavior and her apparent plans for my property. Mrs. Chen, my attorney had said, the power of attorney you signed gives Linda authority to manage your household affairs, but it doesn't give her the right to sell your property or make major financial decisions without your explicit consent. But my attorney had also warned me that the limited power of attorney could be misused if Linda was willing to forge my signature or claim that I was mentally incompetent to make my own financial decisions. If you're concerned about your daughter's intentions, you should consider revoking the power of attorney and making alternative arrangements for managing your affairs, my attorney had advised. The conversation with my attorney had prompted me to take action that would protect my property from Linda's manipulation, while also teaching her a lesson about the dangers of assuming she could control other people's lives and assets. I'd contacted a reputable real estate agent who specialized in quick sales for seniors who needed to liquidate assets for medical or family reasons. Within 2 weeks, I'd received and accepted an offer from a young couple who needed a move-in-ready home and were willing to pay a fair price for immediate possession. The sale had been completed entirely from my room at Willowbrook, with my attorney handling the legal paperwork and the real estate agent managing all the practical details. The proceeds from the sale had been deposited directly into accounts that Linda had no access to, ensuring that she couldn't benefit from the manipulation she'd been planning. But I'd kept the sale secret from all of my children, wanting to see how Linda's behavior would evolve and whether she would continue with her plans to control my living arrangements based on assumptions about my property that were no longer valid. Linda's behavior during my final weeks at Willowbrook had confirmed that her interest in my welfare was secondary to her interest in my assets. She'd been pressuring me to sign additional legal documents that would expand her authority over my finances, and she'd been making arrangements for my transition to assisted living without consulting me about my preferences or plans. I've found a wonderful facility that specializes in stroke recovery, Linda had told me just last week. It's more expensive than staying here, but we can afford it once we sell the house. The casual way Linda had referred to we selling the house had been the final confirmation that she viewed my property as a resource for funding her preferred arrangements for my care. But Linda's most revealing moment had come this afternoon, when she'd arrived for our regular visit with the kind of determined confidence that suggested she was prepared to have a difficult conversation. "Mom," Linda had said, settling into the chair beside my bed with obvious satisfaction, "I think it's time we talked honestly about your future living arrangements." Linda had proceeded to outline her plans for my transition to permanent assisted living, the sale of my house, and the management of my finances in ways that would ensure my comfort and security, while she handled all the practical details. "You don't need to worry about any of the business aspects," Linda had assured me. "I'll take care of the house sale, the assisted living arrangements, and all the financial management, so you can focus on your health and recovery." But it was when I gently suggested that I might want to return to my own home for at least a trial period, that Linda had revealed the true extent of her determination to control my living situation. "Mom, you need to be realistic about your limitations," Linda had said, with the kind of patronizing patience that adults use with confused children. "You've been out of that house for 6 months. You're not the same person you were before your stroke. You can't manage independent living anymore." I'd tried to explain that my physical therapy had been very successful and that my doctors were optimistic about my ability to return home with appropriate support services, but Linda had dismissed my hopes as unrealistic and potentially dangerous. "The house is too big. The maintenance is too expensive and you're too isolated from medical care," Linda had argued. "Trying to go back there would be setting yourself up for another medical emergency." But it was Linda's final comment that had revealed the calculation underlying all of her arguments about my welfare. "You might as well accept reality, Mom," she'd said, leaning forward with unmistakable satisfaction. "You're never going back to that house. This is your home now." The cruelty in Linda's words had been breathtaking, but it had also been the perfect moment to reveal the secret I'd been keeping for 3 weeks. "Actually, Linda," I'd said, watching her confident expression begin to falter, "strangers are living in that house now. I sold it 3 weeks ago." The silence that followed my announcement had been absolute and profound, but it was Linda's reaction that revealed just how completely her plans had been built on assumptions she'd never bothered to verify. Linda's face went through a progression of emotions that would have been comical if the situation hadn't been so serious. Confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally a kind of panicked calculation as she tried to process information that undermined everything she'd been planning for months. "What do you mean you sold the house?" Linda asked, her voice rising to a pitch that suggested she was struggling to maintain her composure. "You can't sell the house. You're in a nursing home. You can't make major financial decisions without consulting the family." The assumption that my residence in a rehabilitation facility somehow eliminated my legal capacity to manage my own property revealed how completely Linda had been thinking of me as an incompetent person whose affairs needed to be managed by more capable family members. "I'm recovering from a stroke, Linda," I said calmly. "I'm not mentally incompetent. I have every right to sell my own property if I choose to do so." But Linda wasn't ready to accept that her months of planning and manipulation had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of both my legal capacity and my awareness of her schemes. "You can't have sold the house without my knowledge," Linda insisted, pulling out her phone with the kind of frantic urgency that suggested she was about to start making calls to verify information she couldn't believe. "I have power of attorney. Any major financial transactions would have to go through me." "The power of attorney you have is limited to household management," I replied. "It doesn't give you authority over major financial decisions like property sales. I can revoke it at any time, and I can certainly make my own decisions about my own assets." Linda's expression shifted from confusion to anger as she realized that the legal authority she'd assumed would give her control over my property was much more limited than she'd understood. "When did you sell it?" Linda demanded. "Who did you sell it to? How much did you get for it?" The barrage of questions revealed Linda's primary concerns: not my well-being or my housing needs, but the financial details of a transaction that she'd been planning to control and benefit from. "I sold it 3 weeks ago to a lovely young couple who needed a family home," I said. "The sale price was fair, and the transaction was handled professionally through my attorney and a qualified real estate agent." "3 weeks ago?" Linda repeated, her voice taking on the kind of sharp edge that meant she was transitioning from shock to anger. "You've been lying to me for 3 weeks? You've been letting me make plans for your care and your living arrangements, while you knew that everything I was planning was based on false assumptions?" The accusation that I'd been lying by not sharing my private financial decisions with someone who had been plotting to manipulate those decisions was both ironic and revealing about Linda's sense of entitlement to information and control over my life. "I haven't been lying about anything," I said firmly. "I've been managing my own affairs, which is my right as a competent adult. You assumed that I would be passive and dependent, and you made plans based on those assumptions without ever asking me what I wanted or needed." Linda stood up from her chair and began pacing the small room with the kind of agitated energy that suggested she was trying to process information that challenged her entire worldview. "This is insane," Linda said, more to herself than to me. "You can't just sell your house and not tell anyone. What are you going to live on? Where are you going to go when you're discharged from here? How are you going to afford assisted living without the equity from the house?" The rapid-fire questions revealed that Linda had been assuming not just that she would control the sale of my house, but that the proceeds from that sale would be used to fund living arrangements that she would choose and manage. I'm going to live on the proceeds from the house sale, which are now safely invested in accounts that provide me with complete financial independence, I said. And I'm going to live wherever I choose to live, based on my own assessment of my needs and capabilities. The mention of accounts that provide me with complete financial independence seemed to hit Linda like a physical blow, probably because she was realizing that her plans to manage my finances were no longer possible. "Mom," Linda said, sitting back down and adopting the kind of reasonable tone that people use when they're trying to regain control of situations that have slipped away from them. "I understand that you want to maintain your independence, but you're not thinking clearly about the practical realities of your situation." The suggestion that I wasn't thinking clearly was clearly designed to undermine my credibility and create doubt about my mental competence, exactly the kind of manipulative tactic that had prompted me to take protective action in the first place. "I'm thinking very clearly," I replied, clear enough to recognize when someone is trying to manipulate my medical situation for their own financial benefit. The direct accusation of manipulation seemed to shock Linda, probably because she'd convinced herself that her plans were motivated by concern for my welfare rather than by her own interests. "I've been trying to help you," Linda protested. "I've been managing your affairs, checking on your house, researching care facilities. Everything I've done has been for your benefit. Everything you've done has been designed to separate me from my property and position yourself to control my finances," I said bluntly. "I've heard your phone conversations about selling the property and getting me settled somewhere comfortable so you could proceed with your plans." Linda's face flushed with embarrassment and anger at the revelation that I'd been aware of her scheming all along. "You were eavesdropping on my private conversations?" Linda asked, as if my awareness of her plots was more problematic than the plots themselves. "I was recovering from a stroke in a nursing home room with thin walls," I replied. "You were having loud conversations about my property right outside my door. It wasn't eavesdropping, it was unavoidable." Linda sat in silence for several minutes, clearly trying to process the collapse of plans she'd been developing for months and figure out how to salvage some control over a situation that had completely escaped her management. "So what's your plan now?" Linda finally asked, her tone shifting from anger to what sounded like grudging acceptance that I was more capable and independent than she'd assumed. "My plan is to complete my rehabilitation here at Willowbrook, then move to a senior living community that I've chosen based on my own research and preferences," I said. "I'll be financially independent, socially engaged, and close enough to family for regular visits while maintaining my privacy and autonomy." The mention of a senior living community that I'd chosen myself seemed to surprise Linda, probably because she'd assumed that such decisions would require her input and approval. "What senior living community?" Linda asked. "When did you research senior living options? I thought you were focused on physical therapy and recovery." "I've been very busy during my 6 months here," I said. "Physical therapy, occupational therapy, financial planning, legal consultations, real estate transactions, and research into housing options. Being in a nursing home doesn't mean being mentally inactive." Linda's assumption that my time at Willowbrook had been passive and dependent revealed how completely she'd underestimated both my capabilities and my determination to maintain control over my own life. "Does Michael know about any of this?" Linda asked, clearly hoping that my other children would support her position or share her concerns about my decisions. "Michael and Susan will learn about my plans when I'm ready to share them," I said, "just like you're learning about them now." "But they're going to be just as shocked as I am," Linda protested. "They're going to want to know why you made these major decisions without consulting the family. They're going to understand that I'm a competent adult who has the right to manage my own affairs," I replied. "And they're going to respect my decisions even if they might have made different choices themselves." Linda's expression suggested that she wasn't as confident as I was about Michael and Susan's likely reactions to my independent decision-making. "Mom," Linda said, "I think you're underestimating how much your stroke has affected your judgment. Making major financial decisions while you're dealing with a serious medical condition might not be the best approach." The return to questioning my mental competence revealed that Linda was still hoping to find a way to challenge my decisions or convince other family members that I wasn't capable of managing my own affairs. "My stroke affected my speech and mobility temporarily," I said firmly. "It didn't affect my intelligence, my judgment, or my legal capacity to make decisions about my own property. But selling your house without discussing it with anyone is such a dramatic change from how you've always handled major decisions," Linda pressed. You've always been someone who consulted with family before making big changes. Linda's observation was actually accurate. I had historically discussed major decisions with my children and often sought their input before making changes to my living arrangements or financial plans. But Linda's own behavior had taught me that such consultation could be dangerous when family members had their own agendas for my assets. I learned that consulting with family about my affairs was a mistake when I discovered that some family members were more interested in controlling my property than in supporting my well-being, I said. The direct accusation seemed to hit Linda harder than my previous comments, probably because it forced her to confront the reality that her behavior had damaged our relationship in ways that went beyond the immediate conflict over my house. I was trying to help you, Linda said, her voice taking on a defensive tone that suggested she was finally beginning to understand how her actions had been perceived. You were trying to help yourself to my house, I replied. There's a difference between helping someone and helping yourself to someone's assets. Linda fell silent again, apparently struggling with how to respond to accusations that were becoming increasingly difficult to deny or justify. What happens now? Linda finally asked, her voice smaller and less confident than it had been at the beginning of our conversation. Now you learn to respect my autonomy and my right to make my own decisions about my life and my property, I said. And I learn to be more careful about who I trust with information about my personal affairs. The conversation was clearly over, but Linda made one final attempt to regain some sense of control or authority over the situation. I still think you should have discussed this with the family before making such a major decision, Linda said. We could have helped you think through all the implications and options. The family could have helped me, I agreed. But you weren't acting as family. You were acting as someone who saw my vulnerability as your opportunity, and that's why you weren't consulted about decisions that were none of your business. Linda left my room that afternoon without her usual expressions of concern for my welfare or promises to handle practical matters on my behalf. The confident, controlling daughter who had arrived planning to finalize arrangements for my permanent institutional care had been replaced by someone who was clearly struggling to accept that her mother was more capable and independent than she'd assumed. But Linda's departure also marked the beginning of a more complicated phase of our family relationships, as news of my house sale and my independent planning would soon reach Michael and Susan, forcing all of us to confront questions about autonomy, trust, and what it really means to support an aging parent's best interests. The house on Maple Avenue was gone, but the lessons about family loyalty and respect for elderly people's independence were just beginning to unfold. The family meeting that Linda orchestrated 3 days later was exactly what I'd expected, a carefully staged intervention designed to convince my other children that I was making dangerous decisions and needed their help to see reason about my living arrangements and financial planning. Linda had called Michael and Susan separately, painting a picture of their mother as a confused elderly woman who was making impulsive decisions that would jeopardize her future security and well-being. By the time they arrived at Willowbrook that Thursday evening, both of my younger children were clearly expecting to find me in a state of mental decline that would require their immediate intervention. "Mom," Michael said as he settled into one of the chairs Linda had arranged around my bed, "Linda told us about the house. We're concerned that you might be making decisions too quickly without considering all the long-term implications." Michael's approach was gentler than Linda's had been, but the underlying assumption was the same, that I was incapable of making sound decisions about my own life and needed family oversight to protect me from my own poor judgment. Susan took a more direct approach, her teacher's instincts making her want to understand the facts before drawing conclusions about my mental state or decision-making capacity. "Mom, can you walk us through what happened with the house sale?" Susan asked. "We want to understand your reasoning and your plans for the future." I appreciated Susan's willingness to listen rather than simply assume that my decisions were problematic, and I spent the next 20 minutes explaining my discovery of Linda's manipulation, my decision to sell the house proactively, and my plans for independent living in a senior community. I sold the house because I realized that some family members were viewing my medical situation as an opportunity to gain control over my property, I explained. I wanted to ensure that my assets remained under my control and that my future living arrangements would be based on my preferences rather than other people's financial interests. Michael and Susan exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to understand that this family meeting was more complicated than Linda had led them to believe. "Linda," Michael said, turning to his sister with a questioning expression, "when you called us about Mum's decision, You didn't mention anything about concerns over your management of her affairs. Linda's response revealed that she'd been selective in sharing information with her siblings, presenting herself as a concerned daughter, trying to help, rather than as someone whose schemes had been discovered and thwarted. I've been trying to help Mom navigate a complex medical and financial situation, Linda said defensively. I've been managing her household affairs and researching appropriate care options. I wasn't scheming. I was being responsible. But you were making plans to sell Mom's house without her input, Susan observed. That doesn't sound like helping. That sounds like taking control. Susan's teacher's instincts for identifying inconsistencies in student explanations were serving her well in analyzing her sister's version of events. I was researching options, Linda protested. I never said I was going to sell the house without Mom's consent. You were telling real estate contacts that the key to selling elderly people's property was to get them settled somewhere comfortable and then present the sale as a practical necessity, I said, repeating the conversation I'd overheard. That doesn't sound like waiting for my consent. Michael leaned forward with the kind of focused attention that meant he was switching into his accountant's analytical mode. Linda, Michael said, did you have any legal authority to sell Mom's house? Was there documentation that would have allowed you to proceed with a sale without Mom's signature? The question cut to the heart of Linda's planning and forced her to confront the reality that her schemes would have required either forging my signature or having me declared mentally incompetent. For the power of attorney Mom signed would have given me authority to manage her financial affairs, Linda said, but her voice lacked conviction. Let me see that power of attorney document, Michael said, with the kind of professional authority that made it clear this wasn't a request. Linda reluctantly pulled out a folder and handed Michael the limited power of attorney that I'd signed during my early weeks at Willowbrook. Michael reviewed the document carefully, his expression growing more serious as he read the specific language that defined the scope of Linda's authority. This power of attorney is limited to household management and routine financial transactions, Michael said after completing his review. It specifically excludes major financial decisions like property sales or investment changes. Linda, you had no legal authority to sell Mom's house. The revelation that Linda's plans would have required illegal actions seemed to shock Susan, who turned to stare at her sister with obvious dismay. Linda, Susan said, were you planning to forge Mom's signature on sale documents, or were you planning to have her declared incompetent so you could act as her guardian? Linda's inability to answer Susan's question directly revealed that she hadn't fully thought through the legal mechanics of her schemes, but had simply assumed that her role as my caregiver would somehow translate into authority over my property. I was going to discuss it with Mom when the time was right, Linda said weakly. I thought she would understand that selling the house was the practical thing to do. And if she didn't agree, Michael pressed, what was your plan if Mom refused to sign the sale documents? Again, Linda couldn't provide a clear answer, suggesting that her planning had been based more on wishful thinking than on realistic assessment of legal requirements or my likely cooperation. I think I understand now why Mom sold the house without consulting us, Susan said quietly. She was protecting herself from someone who was planning to make decisions about her property, whether she agreed or not. Susan's insight into my motivations seemed to shift the dynamic of the family meeting, with my younger children beginning to see my independent action as protective rather than impulsive. But Mom, Michael said, turning back to me with concern that seemed genuine rather than manipulative, selling your house and making major changes to your living situation while you're recovering from a stroke does seem like a lot to handle on your own. Are you sure you don't want family input on these decisions? Michael's question was fair and asked with the kind of respect for my autonomy that Linda had never shown. I appreciated his concern, while also recognizing the difference between offering support and demanding control. I welcome family input, I said, but I've learned to be careful about the difference between family members who want to support my decisions and family members who want to make my decisions for me. The distinction seemed to resonate with both Michael and Susan, who had apparently been concerned about my well-being rather than interested in controlling my assets. Can you tell us about your plans for when you're discharged from here? Susan asked. We want to understand what kind of support you might need and how we can be helpful. I spent the next half hour explaining my research into senior living communities, my selection of Sunset Gardens as my preferred option, and my plans for maintaining independence while having access to appropriate support services. Sunset Gardens has independent living apartments with optional meal plans and housekeeping services, I explained. There's a full medical staff on site, but residents maintain their privacy and autonomy. It's exactly what I need at this stage of my life. Michael nodded approvingly as I described the financial arrangements and the facility's reputation for respecting residents' independence while providing comprehensive support services. That sounds like a well-researched and practical decision, Michael said. Have you visited the facility? Have you spoken with current residents about their experiences? I've had virtual tours and phone conversations with the admissions staff and several residents, I said. I'm planning an in-person visit next week, assuming my doctors approve a day trip. Susan smiled at the thoroughness of my planning, clearly reassured that my decision-making process had been careful and methodical rather than impulsive or emotional. Mom, I'm impressed, Susan said. You've been managing a complex transition while recovering from a serious medical condition. That takes a lot of strength and determination. But Linda seemed uncomfortable with the positive direction the conversation was taking, apparently unwilling to accept that my independent planning had been successful and appropriate. I still think major decisions like this should be discussed with family before they're finalized, Linda said. What if something goes wrong? What if the senior living community doesn't work out? What if Mum needs more medical care than they can provide? Linda's questions were reasonable on the surface, but the tone suggested that she was still hoping to find flaws in my planning that would justify family intervention in my decision-making. Those are all valid concerns, I said. That's why I've researched the facility's policies for residents who need increased care levels, and that's why I've maintained financial flexibility to make changes if my needs change. But wouldn't it be safer to have family involved in these decisions? Linda pressed. Wouldn't it be better to have someone helping you evaluate options and negotiate arrangements? It would be better to have family members who offer support without expecting control in return, I replied. I've learned to distinguish between help that serves my interests and help that serves other people's interests. The pointed comment was clearly directed at Linda, but it also served as a guideline for how I wanted my relationships with all my children to evolve going forward. Michael seemed to understand the implication immediately. Mom, what kind of support would actually be helpful to you? How can we be involved in your life without making you feel like we're trying to control your decisions? The question revealed that Michael was genuinely interested in supporting my well-being rather than managing my affairs, and it opened the door for a more constructive conversation about family relationships and appropriate boundaries. I'd love to have family members who visit regularly, who celebrate my achievements and support me through challenges, and who respect my right to make my own decisions, even when they might make different choices, I said. I want relationships based on love and respect, rather than on assumptions about my competence or my need for management. Susan nodded enthusiastically. That sounds perfect. I want to be part of your life without being part of your business, if that makes sense. It makes perfect sense, I replied. And it's exactly the kind of relationship that will allow us to stay close while respecting each other's autonomy. But Linda still seemed resistant to accepting that her approach to my care had been inappropriate and that my independent decision-making had been both successful and necessary. I just think it's dangerous for elderly people to make major life changes without family oversight, Linda said. What if Mom had made a mistake? What if she had been taken advantage of by unscrupulous people who target seniors? The irony of Linda's concern about me being taken advantage of by unscrupulous people was apparently lost on her, but it wasn't lost on Michael and Susan, who exchanged meaningful glances. Linda, Michael said gently, I think Mom has proven that she's capable of protecting herself from people who might take advantage of her. The house sale was handled professionally, her plans for senior living are well researched, and her financial arrangements provide security and flexibility. Plus, Susan added, Mom identified a potential threat to her independence and took proactive steps to protect herself. That shows excellent judgment and strong self-advocacy skills. The support from Michael and Susan seemed to deflate Linda's remaining arguments about my need for family oversight, but it also seemed to increase her frustration with losing the control she'd been planning to exercise. So we're all just going to pretend that it's normal for a 74-year-old stroke patient to sell her house and choose a living facility without consulting her family? Linda asked. We're going to acknowledge that it's normal for a competent adult to make her own decisions about her own life and property, Michael replied firmly. Age and medical history don't eliminate someone's right to autonomy. Linda's inability to accept that my independent decision-making was both legal and appropriate revealed the depth of her sense of entitlement to control over my affairs. But it also marked the end of her ability to convince other family members that I needed protection from my own judgment. As the family meeting concluded, it was clear that Linda had failed to build the coalition she'd hoped for, while Michael and Susan had gained new respect for my capabilities and my determination to maintain independence. The house on Maple Avenue was gone, but my relationships with my children were evolving in ways that would either strengthen our family bonds or expose the fundamental differences in how we understood love, respect, and appropriate boundaries between generations. The next phase of my recovery would test whether Linda could accept her diminished role in my affairs, and whether Michael and Susan could maintain their supportive approach as I continued to make independent decisions about my life and future. 9 months have passed since that confrontational family meeting at Willowbrook, and as I sit in my sun-filled apartment at Sunset Gardens, watching my great-granddaughter Emma help me tend the small herb garden on my balcony, I'm amazed by how much my life has changed and how profoundly that change has affected my relationships with my children. The transition from Willowbrook to Sunset Gardens had gone exactly as I'd planned, with my discharge from the nursing home coinciding perfectly with the availability of my preferred apartment in the senior living community. The move had been managed efficiently with help from professional services I'd hired, and I'd been settled in my new home within a week of leaving rehabilitation. But the most significant aspect of my transition hadn't been the change in my living situation. It had been the revelation of how my children would adapt to my new independence and their changed roles in my life. Michael and Susan had embraced their new relationship with me enthusiastically, visiting regularly but respecting my privacy, offering support without trying to manage my decisions, and celebrating my independence rather than questioning my competence. They'd helped me personalize my apartment, had dinner with me in Sunset Gardens' dining room, and had made it clear that they were proud of my successful adjustment to my new life. "Mom, you've created exactly the kind of lifestyle that I hope I'll have when I'm your age," Susan had told me during one of her visits. "You're independent but not isolated, active but not overwhelmed, and you've maintained control over your own decisions while having access to support when you need it." Michael had been equally supportive, using his financial expertise to help me optimize my investment portfolio and ensure that my transition to Sunset Gardens was economically sustainable for the long term. "Your planning was excellent," Michael had said after reviewing my financial arrangements. "You'll be able to maintain this lifestyle indefinitely, and you have enough flexibility to upgrade to higher levels of care if your needs change." But Linda's adjustment to my independence had been much more difficult and contentious. She'd struggled to accept that her role in my life had been permanently diminished by her attempts to manipulate my affairs, and she'd made several unsuccessful attempts to reassert control over my decisions. Linda's first challenge had come just 2 weeks after my move to Sunset Gardens, when she'd arrived unannounced during the facility's monthly health assessment meeting and had tried to position herself as my medical advocate and decision-maker. "I'm Margaret's daughter and her designated caregiver," Linda had announced to the medical staff who were reviewing my health status and care needs. "I need to be included in all discussions about her medical treatment and care planning." The assumption that she was my designated caregiver had been both presumptuous and inaccurate, since I'd specifically declined to designate any family member as my medical advocate or care coordinator. "I appreciate Linda's concern," I told the medical staff, "but I'm managing my own healthcare decisions. If I need family input or support, I'll request it myself." Linda's attempt to insert herself into my medical care had failed, but it had also revealed that she hadn't accepted the new boundaries I'd established around family involvement in my personal affairs. Her second challenge had come a month later, when she'd contacted Sunset Gardens administration to express concerns about my social isolation and to suggest that the facility should encourage more family involvement in my daily activities and care planning. "Margaret's family is worried that she's becoming too independent and not maintaining appropriate connections with people who care about her," Linda had told the facility's director. The complaint had been both manipulative and factually incorrect, since Michael and Susan were visiting regularly, and I'd developed active friendships with other residents and participated in numerous community activities. "Mrs. Chen seems to be thriving here," the facility director had told Linda. "She's socially engaged, medically stable, and actively involved in community life. We haven't observed any signs of isolation or withdrawal." Linda's inability to convince Sunset Gardens staff that I needed increased family oversight had frustrated her, but it had also demonstrated that my independence was being supported and respected by the professionals who worked with me daily. The most serious challenge had come 4 months ago, when Linda had attempted to have my mental competence evaluated by claiming that my decision to sell my house and move to senior living had been evidence of cognitive decline that required professional assessment. "Margaret has been making uncharacteristic decisions that suggest she may be experiencing early stages of dementia," Linda had written in a formal complaint to the state's Adult Protective Services. Her family is concerned about her ability to make sound decisions about her financial and living arrangements. The investigation that followed had been thorough and professionally conducted, with cognitive assessments, interviews with my medical providers, and reviews of my decision-making processes and outcomes. The results had been unambiguously supportive of my mental competence and decision-making capacity. Mrs. Chen shows no signs of cognitive impairment or diminished decision-making capacity, the investigating social worker had concluded. Her decisions about housing and financial management have been well-reasoned, successfully implemented, and beneficial to her overall well-being. But more importantly, the investigation had revealed that Linda's complaints were motivated by her own frustration with losing control rather than by genuine concerns about my welfare. The complainant appears to be upset about being excluded from the subject's decision-making process rather than concerned about the quality or appropriateness of those decisions, the social worker had noted in her report. The findings had officially vindicated my independence and competence, while exposing Linda's manipulative tactics as inappropriate and self-serving. But they had also marked the final breakdown of my relationship with Linda, as her willingness to subject me to official investigation revealed the extent to which she was prepared to humiliate and harass me in pursuit of control over my affairs. "Linda," I'd told her during what would be our final conversation, "your attempts to have me declared incompetent have crossed a line that I can't forgive. I won't have a relationship with someone who would rather see me institutionalized than independent." Linda's response had been defensive and self-pitying, focused on her own hurt feelings rather than on the damage her actions had caused to our relationship. "I was trying to protect you from making mistakes that could jeopardize your future," Linda had said. "I was acting out of love and concern, not selfishness. You were acting out of a desire to control my life and my assets," I'd replied. "And your willingness to have me investigated and potentially institutionalized proves that your concern for my welfare is secondary to your need for authority over my decisions." That conversation had taken place 6 months ago, and Linda and I hadn't spoken since. Michael and Susan had tried to mediate between us, but they'd eventually accepted that Linda's behavior had been too extreme and too hurtful for reconciliation to be possible. "Mom, I understand why you can't maintain a relationship with Linda," Susan had told me. "What she did went beyond inappropriate. It was cruel and potentially dangerous to your independence and reputation." Michael had been equally supportive of my decision to cut contact with Linda, recognizing that her actions had threatened not just my autonomy, but also my legal and social standing in the community. Linda's complaint to Adult Protective Services could have resulted in guardianship proceedings that would have eliminated your right to make your own decisions, Michael had explained. Her willingness to risk that outcome shows that she cares more about controlling you than protecting you. The support from Michael and Susan had been crucial during the difficult months of dealing with Linda's challenges to my independence, but it had also revealed the strength of family relationships that are based on mutual respect rather than assumptions about authority and dependence. The contrast between Linda's approach and that of my other children had been stark and instructive. Linda had assumed that my age and medical history gave her the right to make decisions about my life, while Michael and Susan had recognized that my competence and autonomy deserved respect and support. The difference is that Linda saw your stroke as an opportunity to take control, while we saw it as a challenge that you needed support to overcome, Susan had observed during one of our conversations about family dynamics and aging. The insight had captured an important truth about how family members can either support or undermine elderly relatives' independence based on their assumptions about aging, competence, and the appropriate balance between protection and autonomy. But perhaps the most significant development over the past 9 months had been my discovery of how fulfilling independent senior living could be when it's chosen freely rather than imposed by others. Sunset Gardens had provided exactly the combination of independence and support that I'd hoped for. My apartment was private and comfortable, the meal plans were flexible and high quality, and the medical staff was available when needed, but not intrusive in daily life. More importantly, the community of residents had provided social connections and shared activities that had enriched my life in ways that living alone in my house never could have achieved. "I've made more close friends in 9 months here than I made in 9 years living alone," I told Michael during one of his visits. "The social opportunities and shared interests have made this the most active and engaging period of my life since your father died." The friendships I'd developed with other residents had also provided validation for my decision to sell my house and embrace community living. Many of my neighbors had made similar transitions from family homes to senior communities, and their experiences had confirmed that such moves could be liberating rather than limiting when they were made by choice rather than necessity. I held onto my house for 5 years longer than I should have. my neighbor Dorothy had told me. I was so worried about losing my independence that I didn't realize how isolated and burdened I'd become, trying to maintain a property that was too big for my needs. The perspective from other residents had helped me understand that my decision to sell my house had been not just financially wise but emotionally beneficial, freeing me from responsibilities that had been weighing me down without providing corresponding benefits. The community activities at Sunset Gardens had also allowed me to pursue interests and hobbies that I'd never had time for during my years of home ownership and caregiving. I'd joined a book club, taken up watercolor painting, and become involved in the facility's community garden project. "You're busier now than you were when you lived in your own house," Susan had observed with amusement during one of her visits. "I can barely keep up with your schedule of activities and commitments." The active lifestyle had been possible partly because of the support services that handled household maintenance, meal preparation, and other practical responsibilities, but also because of the social environment that encouraged engagement and participation. As I reflect on the past 9 months from the comfort of my apartment at Sunset Gardens, I'm grateful for the stroke that forced me to reevaluate my living situation and family relationships. Even though the medical crisis itself was frightening and difficult, the stroke had revealed truths about my family that I needed to understand, and it had provided the catalyst for changes that have improved my quality of life in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Linda's attempts to control my recovery and my decisions had taught me important lessons about the difference between support and manipulation, and about the importance of maintaining autonomy even when family members claim to know what's best for me. Michael and Susan's respectful approach to my independence had shown me that adult children can maintain close relationships with aging parents without assuming authority over their decisions or treating them as incompetent simply because they're elderly or have experienced medical challenges. Most importantly, my successful transition to independent senior living has proven that aging doesn't have to mean losing control over your own life, and that the right living situation can enhance rather than limit opportunities for growth, friendship, and personal fulfillment. The house on Maple Avenue is now home to a young family with children who are probably creating memories in the backyard where my own children once played. I'm glad that the property is being used by people who need and appreciate it, rather than sitting empty while family members argued over its value or disposition. The strangers who live there now are welcome to all the happiness that address can provide, just as I'm welcome to all the happiness that my new address provides. Sometimes the best way to preserve what's important about your past is to make brave decisions about your future. And sometimes the people who claim to love you most are the ones who understand you least. My daughter Linda wanted to control my life because she thought she knew what was best for me, but my other children have supported my independence because they trust me to know what's best for myself. That trust has made all the difference in determining not just where I live, but how I live, and how I approach each day with confidence rather than fear, autonomy rather than dependence, and gratitude rather than resentment. The house may belong to strangers now, but my life belongs to me, exactly as it should be.